Okay. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and thank you very much. It's an honor to address an audience of the United Nations Association, who would think that the United Nations and all it stands for, multilateralism, international cooperation, and so on, will be considered a radical thing today, compared with even 10 to 20 years ago. And today, of course, is 6th of June, and we mark the Normandy landings as well. And the Normandy landings in 1944 inaugurated the basis of the world in which we, in a way, we still continue to live. A large number of the institutions which still exist and are still very influential and powerful globally were formed as a result of the Allied victory in the West, but also the Soviet victory in the East, but then later on, decolonization and the rise of the Third World and post-colonial states and their challenges to world order by the 1960s and 1970s and so on. So we are shaped by very strong historical trends and currents and so on. And the United Nations, as a kind of landmark institution formed in 1945, kind of marked a new phase of world history. But locked into that same institution were often also the pathologies of the world which constructed the United Nations and the United Nations system, and the system which we come to know as the rules-based order or the liberal international order itself. And so, of course, there's a narrative, there's a story about the United Nations as this idealistic, misty-eyed people's construction after the Second World War. And there is something to that too, because there's a huge human demand for a kind of global governance, if you like, beyond national government and nationalism itself. There was a big demand that there not be another world war. There had been two. There not be kind of a massive kind of a nationalisms clashing with one another, which had kind of, if you like, beggared each other and neighbors and so on. Autarky, empire, the Ottawa system, and so on. All of that had generated the Great Depression, which has caused massive amounts of unemployment and distress as well. So it's great to be here, and I'm really thankful to Sohail to somehow discovering that I exist, which is half the time I don't know that I exist myself, and I do wonder what I'm doing. But nevertheless, yes, I've been hidden in the library for many decades and studying the world. And in the last few years, the world has just come knocking on my door, even. Nobody can hide in a library anymore. You can't hide from it. The world just comes knocking, and you know it when your oil prices go up, there are queues outside the petrol stations, the food prices go up, and people are marching on the street because of war somewhere quite far away. So I think the world has shrunk in so many different ways. So, as I say, if you like, 1945 is often seen as a benchmark year for the construction of the world order to some extent, which is, if you like, in a period of turbulence and crisis at the moment. And what I want to do, I do want to talk about that system, that Bretton Woods system, which included the United Nations, but also the IMF and the World Bank, and later on many other organizations as well. But I want to put the United States, if you like, at the center of it, because that is the area that I'm most familiar with, and the power whose works and history and development I've studied systematically, really since about 1987, actually. And I must admit, it's a fantastic society. It's a fantastic culture. It's an incredible experiment in human history. But it is also has many, many deep pathologies as well. There are many stories going on simultaneously and clashing with one another. This year, the United States marks 250 years since the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And there are huge struggles over the meaning of 1776. Huge struggles of what does the United States stand for? Who is an American? Who belongs and who doesn't belong? Who's in and who's out? History is always fought over. And there is no one happy story that I'm going to tell. And I don't think that happy story exists. I think what we have is a great deal of complexity and a great deal of many different clashing ideas, traditions, institutions, leaders, political movements, parties, and so on. And that entire messiness we try to sort of make into something more orderly and understandable and comprehensible in order to tell a smoother story than might actually exist itself. So I want to thank you for inviting me today to have a think about how to express some of my thoughts to a broad audience, probably quite well informed, but curious about the world as well. And I would say that the United Nations as an institution is a part of the future of the international order. It is not going to disappear. It has never been fully, there is no golden age of the United Nations, actually. Now, on the drive here, I was just thinking the story of the United Nations, whose founding papers I've studied during the Second World War. Not I wasn't in the Second World War, but I studied the papers from the Second World War period. All kinds of ideological clashes about what it ought to be, who it ought to represent, and what the powers in it ought to be, and who should hold power within it. And the Security Council, if you like, the five big powers, well, four big powers plus China, which they thought would become part of the Western world order, remain very, very powerful. The General Assembly was at that time, in 1945 to 1955, effectively a creature of the West. It was largely powers which were subsidized in various kinds of ways. Later on, as independence went across Asia, Africa, and so on, then the General Assembly changed. But from the very beginning of the United Nations, there was a selectivity about what the UN was for, who it was for, and how it was to be used, including by its own founding members. So the Korean War, for example, was the first war fought under the auspices of the United Nations, but actually it was dominated by the United States, which largely ignored the other powers which were sending their soldiers and so on. That is to say, you can have international organizations which preach the sort of idea of international cooperation and equality of nations and sovereignty of nations and that kind of thing. But in practice, world politics is dominated by the most powerful states, by the most powerful actors in those states and across those states themselves, and now on a kind of transnational basis. So, if you like, power works, but it works in favor, on the whole, of those who have the most of it. That is, the biggest amount of money, the largest amount of weaponry, the biggest military forces, the largest economies and financial systems, and so on. What is peculiar about the post-1945 order, if you like, is that it has enabled over 50, 60, 70, 80 years or more, it has enabled the construction of a world system. And that center of that liberal international order, Anglo-American power at the beginning and American power throughout, has created, if you like, particularly since 1989, what could be called a one world order, in which the majority of states and economies in the world are heavily integrated and interdependent, and I would argue strongly interpenetrated. And I think that level of that interpenetration, that is, they're locked, you and me, I'm in you, and you're locked together in this, is probably the best, most optimistic scenario, which would indicate that a world war of the types that we saw in the 20th century is very unlikely in this century. That is not to say that military conflicts and so on, and small wars or relatively small wars or limited wars won't happen, and they are happening all around. We can see them now. But in terms of great power warfare, probably the conditions for that great power warfare are not good at this particular time. And I will go into some of that a bit later on. And that's where this invention in a library called critical multiplexity doesn't mean anything to anybody else other than me and about three other people. That's where that theory tries to kind of capture what I've just sort of said in and try to explain a bit more. And if there is time and some interest, I can answer some questions about it as well. So today, most people are, when watch the news and you listen to the commentators, a large number of them are really basically saying that the core power of the global order, the core power of the Bretton Woods system and so on, the United States, is in decline. That there are other powers like the BRICS and so on, China especially, which are on the rise, and that is now signaling the decline of the West and the decline of the leader of the West, which is the United States, and that there's going to be a very different kind of world order in which the United States is no longer going to be the hegemonic power or the lone superpower and so on. To some extent, there's a controversy around this term decline. I don't think the United States is declining. I think the world situation has changed and is changing, and there's a transition going on. But when we take a step back from the hyperbole, often which is in public life, what we see that is the United States appears more about direct control today, asserting more and more of its military power, coercive power, particularly under Donald Trump, but before that as well. But actually, its core powers, which include the military, are many, and they are interlocked with one another. And that a large number of their powers, if you like, are institutional. We still have a very dense transnational system of institutions which have effectively locked in very large number of countries. In fact, the majority of the countries of the world, and the system, the power behind the system, we know the on-off switch for the electricity, but behind it, there's an entire system which produces that electricity for us. That system, the surface of which we see, runs very, very deep, and it's very dense and extremely extensive. It's that system, if you like, that set of structures, which effectively shape the way in which the world works and the governments and economies and other militaries within it work. That system largely still belongs to the United States. That system still largely belongs to the United States and its allies, which shows that it's an incredibly resilient system, and it has survived and is continuing to survive with all its ups and downs because it is integrative. It has largely integrated the countries, economies, societies, or even cultures of the world and the states of the world into that system. Now, there are others which have that doesn't mean to say they're all equal. There are sort of a core and there's there's peripheries and there's semi-peripheries and so on. That is to say, there's a kind of concentric circles of power in the world, that not all states are in the core of it. But nevertheless, they are in the kind of orbit of that system. And their economies, their jobs, their livelihoods, the future, the opportunities in their society for their young children and students and so on, they're all kind of integrated with one another and affected by that. That system, if you like, the underlying power of that system, with large parts of which is invisible or seemingly invisible, sets the agendas for what is going to happen in the next 10 to 20 years. They define, through the sheer power of their kind of control or influence in culture, in world culture, mass culture, national cultures, in media institutions, in political parties, pressure groups like the United Nations Association, and tens of thousands of ways. They define, if you like, what is common sense. You just have to switch on the TV, the radio, pick up a newspaper or look at a website or look at your phone or whatever. That system is beaming messages at us, you, me, everybody, all of the time. There's a very famous quote from an American journalist in 1963 who said, the mass media doesn't tell you what to think. What it does do very successfully and spectacularly well is what to think about. So the setting of those agendas of what is really important right now is a very, very powerful force because it's within the boundaries of thinkable thought within which that we operate. And sometimes that system is so powerful, we don't even know that these are the boundaries. We may believe that we are actually free. But who designs that system and who pays for that system and for the upkeep of the system is still largely the United States. The United States pays for the majority of what you could call of the international system, the liberal international order, or the liberal world order. Who polices against piracy all the choke points in the world, as much as they possibly can? Is the United States navies which police that. But the United States now is demanding that the costs of policing, the costs of institutional design, the costs of paying for these institutions should be more widely shared, that they cannot any longer sustain that level of spend because of their own fiscal problems. They've got a massive debt and so on. So those state societies, economies, which I argue emerging economies like the BRICS and many others as well, they have effectively come to where they are largely as a success, as a result of the successes of the American system. That is, they're integrated through a globalized order into those kind of that broadly open world economy where you can buy and sell, people can move, and so on and so forth, and investment flows around the world. And there's been a huge relocation of industry, of manufacturing and production from the West to the East. And that has created the workshop of the world that is China. That's not to say China has not exercised agency. After Mao, China exercised a lot of agency to open up itself to be integrated into the West. And China may today be seen by many as a strategic rival and so on. It is a challenger in certain ways, but it's also one of the upholders of that very liberal system because it has benefited probably more than many societies. Probably 50% of the Chinese population has benefited from globalization, which is probably the single largest proportion of people. 400-500 million lifted out of poverty as a result of globalization. The other side of it is that China, as a revolutionary power, outside of that system, was financing national liberation struggles in Asia and Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. It was a thorn in the side of the United States. The Sino-Soviet split from the 60s was partly engineered and then opened up by Nixon, Kissinger, and others in the 1970s to prize away the two communist powers from one another, to align one with themselves in order to weaken the Soviet Union. Now, you could argue that Trump is trying to do the opposite, which is prize away Russia from China. China is the stronger power, in order later to take them on one by one rather than simultaneously. The big debate in the American foreign policy establishment today is all about when to take on the two biggest enemies of the United States, or the biggest challengers, rivals. And do you take them on together, simultaneously? And that's the Democratic Party. Do you take them on one by one? That's the Trump wing, which is largely the Republican Party. So all this stuff that Putin's got something on him, Putin has some information. I think everybody's got something on Donald Trump. He's got so many court cases, so many scandals. It doesn't appear to make any difference to how he lives or wins or loses or anything like that. So there's a huge geopolitical struggle going on. But I would argue this is not the Kaiser in 1914. This is not Adolf Hitler in 1939. This is not the carving up the world, which has been kind of already carved up between the empires, because effectively there's a broadly open world economy with some blockages and so on. That is, all are welcome as long as you fit the market. That suggests that interdependence and interpenetration means that they survive together or they're going to fall together because they're so interlocked. The collapse of China is not an American national interest. The collapse of the United States is not a Chinese national interest either. They're two locked together. 2008, the financial crash, if the Chinese had not held on to American debt and American dollars and chosen to put the knife in, the world economy would have collapsed, along with it, the Chinese economy as well. So that level of interpenetration is a kind of insurance, I would say. Doesn't mean to say it's all going to be a bed of roses, but it is a kind of insurance against a world war. But there are wars which are really bad, which are so-called limited wars. We've had people call it sort of a period of peace since 1945. Well, actually, no, it hasn't. If you ask the Koreans and the Vietnamese and the Cambodians and large numbers of Latin Americans and Africans and so on, the bodies are piled up. Dozens of millions of people have been killed in those wars, or proxy wars or direct wars and so on. It's not been a period of peace, not for most people, but a period of peace for a particular segment of the world, geographically quite restricted, Western Europe and North America. The invasion of the Ukraine in 2022 brought home the degree to which the insulation of the West had been actually carrying out. So we live in this kind of global system. This global system has got a lot of chopping and changing and so on going on within it. But its roots lie not in 1945, actually. I would track them back. And the roots of Trumpism, and I would say Trumpism, yes, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump myself, but Trumpism is not an aberration. It is not an outlier. It's not something which is kind of from some other planet. Donald Trump is a production of the American system. Donald Trump, in fact, I would say, which is Sir Hal kindly talked about the book I'm writing, I would say the roots of Trumpism lie in Wilsonianism, in the philosophy and practices of Woodrow Wilson, who was president of the United States from 1913 to 1921, and who was the father of the League of Nations, with his 14 points and the formation. Then obviously the US Senate voted against American membership of it. But that period, if you like, laid the foundations of what I would argue Trump. Everything which was present in Wilson and the Wilsonian era is present today in the Trump era itself. Yeah. About the Wilsonian Trump. Yes. Correct. Yes. Okay, that's what I was going to talk about next. So. Thank you. I'll pay you later. Yeah. So okay. So there you have. If we take our minds back to the First World War period, you've got the world is divided up into empires, and then wannabe empires waging war on the existing empires to carve up the world or redivide the world themselves. The United States comes in 1917, but later in 1917, there are two big things that happen in Russia. The two revolutions which occur, which the successful Bolshevik Revolution. Those are world-changing events which happen within the space of about 8 months in 1 year in world history, which they rock the world even more than World War I itself. Woodrow Wilson, who had campaigned on a promise of peace in 1916 when he was returned to the White House, they knew they were going into war. They knew that if Germany took over the whole of the continent of Western Europe, the United States could well be endangered, as well as its very large number of investments in Europe itself as well. And the other thing, of course, is that with each successive war, the empires were using up their capital, their power, their money, their treasure, and they were getting weaker. And for Britain, David Reynolds has traced the decline of the British Empire with every war from Crimea onwards, that each time waging war has meant going to the United States and borrowing money. And the more you borrow, the more you owe, and therefore the more power and influence the lenders have on you. And of course, Wall Street and the City of London are completely integrated, not just now, but they were even by the 1890s into the 1910s and 1920s, when the dollar comes up against the pound and the American economy. United States Steel in 1900, one single company produces more steel than the rest of the world's steel industries put together. The US is China, right? That's what it is. It's this huge power. So you've got these declining empires waging wars which are costing them more and more, and this rising power which says we're not an empire, we're an anti-colonial country. We fought against empire to create a free country and so on. We got a new vision for the world, and that vision we call Wilsonianism. That is, the world will be run not by an empire which will militarily and otherwise control a territory and an economy and a people and so on, and decide who goes, what goods flow in and out and so on. They'll be decided through an international system in which each state has membership, and in that membership we will form associations like the League of Nations and so on, in which countries can discuss their security, resolve their disputes, settle their arguments and so on without war. That war is caused by autocracies and undemocracies, which, if you like, are interested in territory and empire and gain for self-aggrandizement. We have a new system, a new idea called freedom, and that freedom is going to be run through institutions, and those institutions are going to be based around kind of democratic, liberal values. That's Woodrow Wilson. But there's another Woodrow Wilson right alongside the same Woodrow Wilson that I've just pointed out. That's the Woodrow Wilson who segregated racially Washington, D.C., who segregated the federal government, who sacked thousands of African-American workers who had been enjoying jobs in federal government since the 1860s and 1870s, after the Civil War, but then who were sacked. He set up separate toilets, separate entrances and exits for African-Americans. He brought the Ku Klux Klan into the White House. He showed a film called The Birth of the Nation, which is a Klan film, in 1915 in the White House itself. That is to say, and so that's just one part of that. He's the president, he's a PhD, the only PhD who ever became president. Professor of political science at Princeton University, became the president of Princeton University itself, was a Southerner. And all his sensibilities, all his philosophy and so on, for all the liberalism. So when it came to the League of Nations discussions, for example, and Japan said, well, why don't we have a racial equality charter, President Wilson? No, thank you. No racial equality here. No self-determination of nations. I mentioned to you the Bolshevik Revolution. So the Wilson moment, a lot of historians say, the Wilson moment is also a Lenin moment. Proletarian internationalism is a powerful force. And what did Lenin do when the Bolsheviks got in? He said to the workers in the trenches, the people in the trenches, this war is not for you. You're going to get nothing out of this. Wage war. Turn your guns on the ruling classes who sent you here to fight and die so they could, because he revealed the secret treaties. All the secret treaties, all the allies had signed with each other to transfer tens of thousands of square miles of land to one another as a part of the treasure that they were fighting over. Lenin published the secret treaties because they took them from the Tsar. And once the Tsar was out, they published the treaties and everybody saw what the World War was really all about. So the proletarian internationalism, working class internationalism, says workers have no country. You are a class, a transnational class, and your ruling classes have sent you to fight for them and die for them and so on. So the Wilson moment of self-determination in the League of Nations and liberal internationalism is a rival to an existing proletarian internationalism. The ILO, the International Labour Organization, was founded directly as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution demanded workers of the world unite and all this kind of thing. The ILO was an attempt to water down the demands of proletarian internationalism to a kind of liberal domestic reform and so on. So embedded in Wilsonianism is anti-communism, class politics, and of course, 1919 to 1921. Wilson's armies go to Russia to overthrow the Bolshevik Revolution, along with 16 or so other countries' armies. Within 1919, 1921, there's a massive rise of the Communist Party, Labour parties, trade unions, strikes, general strikes, Boston police strike. It's called the Red Scare of 1919. The country, there's even a big bomb in Wall Street which kills 30-odd people and so on. That is massive uprisings of working class people against the wages and conditions and so on in that country. That is to say, a challenge to the hegemony of, if you like, the kind of American capitalistic system. it's encouraged by November 1917, the October-November revolutions set off a wave. When did the British Labour Party adopt Clause 4? Nobody remembers that anymore, probably, but Clause 4 was the ownership by the people of the means of production, distribution, exchange, and so on. That was in after the Bolshevik Revolution. So the Bolshevik Revolution is often sort of sidelined as something which happened somewhere far away, but actually it had a powerful effect. It had a powerful effect, and it constructed anti-communism. Up until 1989, anti-communism then became the fundamental rationale for American foreign policy. So Wilsonianism then is steeped in all of these kinds of ideologies and ideas and interests. And of course, the corporate political economy of American politics, big money. You can't run elections and politics and so on. It's a country with a huge industry. Industry donates to political parties and candidates, and it's the party machine. There's a kind of very well-known phenomenon. The party machines are owned by the people who own the big bucks and so on. So President Woodrow Wilson is in those things as well, but he's also a social reformer in various ways. He's also a liberal in various ways, but he's also this stuff. So the League of Nations then, if you like, has embedded within it imperial power, class power, anti-communism, and corporate interests and so on. It's a new way at a time when the empires are declining and anti-colonialism is rising. I mean, for Britain, even Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, and others weren't that interested in staying within the empire on the old terms by 1917. They were just not interested. It was disintegrating, right? The levels of nationalism and so on rising, but anti-colonialism in general in the world was rising, and we know all about the things that Easter Rising 1916 in Ireland, then you got the Amritsar massacre in India and so on. There's a huge ferment going on. Wilsonianism is in the maelstrom of a Bolshevik revolution, of an anti-colonial revolution, and a kind of big shift in power. It offers a new concept, not empire, not territory, but institutions. And we can set up these institutions and others can join. But there's always a barrier as well, because it's embedded in class relations, it's embedded in race relations and so on. So in that sense, what I suggest is that if we look at the elite networks which are gathered around Wilsonianism, it's a thing of beauty, actually. I mean, it's horrendous, but it's a thing of beauty. The design of that machine, that system, which happens from the 1880s and 1890s into the 1910s and 1920s, and is perfected in the 30s and 40s, and is this banking thing, which includes the United Nations, by the way. The United Nations building in New York is on land bequested by the Rockefellers, right? The Rockefellers are part of this entire machinery of Wilsonianism, and they still are. Rockefellers, Carnegies, Vanderbilts, then later on the Henry Fords and others, all of them set up various kinds of foundations. These foundations are fabulously wealthy. They set up universities. They set up think tanks and women's organizations and student organizations and all kinds of library corners, international mind alcoves in little towns and villages all across the United States. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, etc., etc. I mean, the sky is, if you were to put them as a sky, it would block out the sun. There is so much of it. And so what I argue is then that this world that we now live in today, in which Trump is seen as this kind of, I mean, I do every day, I say, oh, are you crazy? Etc. It's my job to read his Truth Socials first thing in the morning. And it's not a great way to start your day, I have to say. My pulse rate kind of goes up. But luckily, because I have some historical knowledge, I think, yes, he will be gone, hopefully, one day. But that also, that when he goes, you don't go back to normalcy, because he's not alone. He's not alone in the world. There are lots of people like him. Every country has a variation of Donald Trump, either in power or near power or wanting power or possibly likely to get power next time. And that's been the case for a while. So Trump is not alone in the world. And secondly, he's not alone in US history. There have been governors and senators just like him, but never somebody in the White House. But he is a kind of construction of all of the tendencies that I talked about in the Wilsonian period and all the contradictions of those tendencies from the Wilson period, but on a global scale. And Donald Trump, if you like, he's trying to save the American system. He may be seen as by many as an enemy of that American system, but actually I think he's the savior of that American, or trying to save that American system. Now, of course, you take his personality and put it into a separate area. Yes, he has all kinds of ways in which he talks, what he writes, all the stuff he says, and so on. But don't be fooled. He's not stupid. He wants you to think he's stupid. And that's the trouble. You treat somebody like that as stupid, you've discredited your own argument. It's better to talk about policies and what they do and whom they benefit. And when you look at those, and not the kind of aura, because he said of media coverage is, oh, he said this today. Is it true? Oh, let's go check the facts. So all the people who live in the so-called evidence-based community go around checking his facts. Great. He's got you thinking what he wants you to think about. Meanwhile, he's doing 10 other things behind your back that are going to hurt a lot of different people. So that watchdog role of the media is immediately sidetracked by what he says. He chucks stuff in the air and people look up in the air and he's picking your pocket, right? And I think that's the magic of Donald Trump. But underneath all that, take away the fog and so on and blow that away, what do you see? 3 things which are present in the Wilsonian period remain present today. 1, American exceptionalism, that the United States is the superior power. It is the leader. It will do because it knows best what is right. It is the hope of the world. It was a liberal version in the Wilson period, and it's a different version, more illiberal today. But today it comes through as exemptionalism. That is, you are exempt from normal rules because you're not a normal country. You're a superior country, which knows best. So you can go and say, I'm going to take over Greenland. I'm going to kidnap the president of Venezuela. I might invade Panama. I'm going to wage war, do blah, 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 and so on and so forth. So American exceptionalism, we are not normal. We are different and superior. And therefore, we have exclusion and exemptions from everything. So one of the big things about liberal imperialism or liberalism, John Eikenberry at Princeton argues, is that the United States is not an empire because it set up a system of rules which bound it to. That is to say, the first world power, which set up a system of rules which were rules for it as well, that could be applied to it as well. But that's never fully been the case. Multilateral when we can, unilateral when we must. Bill Clinton, right? That is, we're going to do what we're going to do. If we can get it through multilateral, we get these people to agree with us, great. If not, then I think, oh, we've got a massive military, we've got a massive economy, we've got a massive financial system, we control the world's currency through the dollar, we can sanction you, we can blockade you, we can stop you doing this and this, we can stop our foreign aid and so on, or give foreign aid to your enemies, etc. There's lots of ways in which. So American exceptionalism is one thing. Second thing, I would argue, is the corporate political economy. That the robber barons of the 1880s and 1890s, who were the kind of financial, economic, manufacturing base of power and politics in the 1910s and 1920s, in the Wilsonian period, that corporate political economy, there's different people, but a lot of them are also exactly the same. That military-industrial complex, which now exists and has existed since the 1950s and 60s, is absolutely enormous. It is going to consume. Donald Trump is asking for $1.5 trillion military budget from next year. And there's not many people arguing with him. They say America's polarized. It's not. Look at the votes on the military budget. They're not polarized. 90% of the House, 90% of the Senate will vote for $1 trillion budget. That corporate political economy, which underpins American power, is exactly there. So that's the second thing. First thing, American exceptionalism and Wilsonianism. Second thing, corporate political economy. And the third thing, I argue, is all those institutions, all those elite networks, which I would sort of lump together in a term, US foreign policy establishment. That US foreign policy establishment was effectively formed on the basis of all that wealth of the Rockefellers, Carnegies, and Fords, and so on. That wealth translated into foundations, so-called philanthropic foundations, which end up as universities, think tanks, and so on and so forth, a whole plethora, and political party and media organizations and so on. Those elite networks focused around Wall Street, the state, the academy, and so on. That set of institutions has a core, and that core is the American foreign policy establishment. That's largely a Wilsonian construction. That Wilsonian construction had a large number of institutions. At the center of it, I would argue, is the New York-based Council on Foreign Relations, which publishes a magazine, journal, since 1922, called Foreign Affairs. And Foreign Affairs is read by about 15 to 20% of the leaders of most of the countries of the world. It's the mind of the American elite. There is the range of thinkable thought among the people who think themselves, and they do. When you read their private papers, they think of themselves as masters of the universe. They may talk a lot about equality and sovereignty and equality of nations and liberalism and peace and friendship, but inside their decision-making private places, they have a view of the world, which is they're in charge, and they will largely do it. That's called hegemony. But hegemony is made up of two things. One, persuasion. Good. If you agree, let's go. But if you don't, the other part is coercion. Just behind the foundation, the think tank, the university, Hollywood, etc., is a huge aircraft carrier with large numbers of jets which can take off and start bombing if you don't come peacefully. So in that regard, that's why I say that Trumpism is rooted in Wilsonianism, and that the boundaries of thinkable thought in American foreign policy thinking and in American hegemony are the kind of liberal face with a very large coercive element, and a coercive face with a very large liberal kind of element. So, and it depends on the world situation, which combination of those are actually applied. And right now, well, it's complicated now, is that there are more powers, more actors in world politics with more agency and more assertiveness than has ever existed probably in the history of the planet. That is to say, there are more demands, and those are just from the elites. So these are corporations, various kinds of international organizations, states, governments, and so on. They're crowded. The world is crowded with all those voices. They all sit, what I would argue, is on top of volcanoes. Those volcanoes are the ordinary people. And those ordinary people, large proportions of them, are not very happy. Globalization has not delivered everything that was promised. It's delivered a sort of social polarization, economic inequality, and political polarizations, and so on, that large numbers of people, particularly in parts of the world where you had the Industrial Revolution, where the transfer of those jobs to other parts of the world because it's cheaper and so on, large parts of those people are still suffering from the consequences of what happened in the 60s, 70s, and into the 1980s. And every country has its kind of equivalent sort of groundswell of opposition and discontent. And the management of that opposition and discontent, I would argue, filters through to the kind of divisive politics of political elites themselves. I would argue that the most decisive force in the politics of most countries today is a force for divide and rule, over discontented populations whose interests those elites cannot actually satisfy. The demands they cannot satisfy or will not satisfy, because the concentration of wealth and income and power is in such a small number of hands, who then bleed into the political agendas and so on, and they are self-interested, and they want to maintain that kind of state of affairs. So in that sense, that's why I argue that, that Trumpism, you can do British equivalents, French equivalents, German equivalents, Italian equivalents, Hungarian equivalents, Indian equivalents, they're everywhere. It's not a coincidence. It's systemic. And that's why Trump, if you like, once he leaves, eventually, is not going to change very much. But because of the interpenetrations and so on I talked about earlier, I don't think we're going to necessarily head towards a sort of conflagration of the type of the two world wars either. But possibly there's a Chinese scholar, Wang Jixi, and he says, people say, oh, is it a Cold War? He says, no, it's a hot peace. That's quite good, hot peace. And I think that's probably what sums up today. It's a hot peace. So you can't ever rest, but maybe it won't get out of control either, because, really, the way I think about it is also, in the Soviet era, the Cold War era, you had actual two military camps, two types of economy, two ideologies at war with each other. And we did not go into a world war. In that sense, weirdly, nuclear weapons are a very important part of the way in which the world works, and is likely to try to make sure that war doesn't break out on a very large scale between great powers, because that is the kind of final stage. But anyway, I'll stop there because I've kind of gone on for quite a long time, and I think I probably said everything I want to say as well. All right. Thank you.
Ready for 15 odd minutes. If you wouldn't mind repeating the question so that the Zoom picks up they can't hear the audience, so you have to repeat summarize the question.
Oh, right, okay.
Before answering.
Oh, right, okay.
Well, thank you very much for really comprehensive analysis. Right at the end, you mentioned nuclear weapons, and my understanding is that one of the big subscribers to that sense of anti-communism and an interest in nuclear weapons was Winston Churchill. He was instrumental in introducing British artists into the Manhattan Project. Bringing it up to date, as you may have heard, just last week, the United Nations Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons failed. They couldn't get a consensus, and instrumental in that was the United States saying this isn't the Treaty on nuclear disarmament, this is the Treaty on Non-Proliferation. And yet you have Trump complaining about Iran's acquisition of a nuclear weapon. So sometimes you kind of think, what sort of game are they playing? Are they maintaining nuclear deterrence, nuclear coercion? You mentioned that massive budget. But of course, that has an impact on what our government was saying in the Strategic Defence Review last year, where we're very pro-nuclear. So it's this so-called phrase, the special relationship. What interests me is the impact that America and Trump has on our government, on our expenditure. We will probably spend a huge amount of our taxes on militarisation, which affects us all. And there is a sense from, say, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists that the risk assessment of nuclear war is a little bit higher than hot issues. So those are some of my points.
Sure.
responsibility on.
Yeah. Shall I take it, or do you want to go around the room a bit more? Okay.
See, we are truly fast. Are there options for the future where we can escape this entrapment of the order that you described?
Okay, there's quite a lot of questions there. Okay, so I'll try to summarize. It seems to be Brent here was asking, in a way, about why is there a degree of hypocrisy among those who are in the nuclear club already, about others who may want to enter it for their own reasons. And the second one was, then you went on to the special relationship, so-called, one of my favorite subjects. Oh my God. And how, what effect that has on Britain. And then the third one was, we seem to be in a kind of bit of a bind, a trap of kind of turbulence and conflict, and what's the way out of that? Well, I'll try to deal with as much of those that I can. Well, on the kind of nuclear front, I mean, the desire to dominate the production and use of nuclear weapons started pretty much with a broken promise by the Americans to Churchill, right? That what they thought was going to be like a joint condominium, Anglo-American, you know, Churchill had many strengths, but he had many weaknesses and blind spots as well. And his view was that, oh, these people, these naive Americans who have got like big muscles, but not much brain, and we have smaller muscles, but a lot of brain, we're going to control this young lad and harness him to the empire, and we're going to keep going forward, and we're going to have these nuclear weapons, which we can then lord it over the rest of the world. Well, first of all, the Americans said, okay, thank you very much. We know exactly what you think about us, because in their papers, while Churchill and Eden and others are talking of what, you know, in a more kind of less crude fashion, what I just described, the Americans think we are like this and this and this, but we are not. And so when Britain talks about America at that time, it was Anglo-American. When the Americans talked about Britain and the United, they called it American-British relations, right? America first, not Britain first, not Anglo, and not, you know. So already there's a jockeying for position and nuclear superiority. And that's the first betrayal that people complain about and so on. There are others later on. And the second thing, of course, is the prevention of getting that nuclear technology to anybody else. And of course, by 1949, the Soviet Union has exploded and tested and so on. So in that sense, then, there's an attempt to try to control the size of the nuclear club, but they never fully can. China by the 1960s, India, Pakistan, right? The Europeans have said they would like, Britain has its so-called, you know, independent, not very independent nuclear deterrent, and so on. So there's always been an attempt to maintain control of weapons of mass destruction. And of course, they're expensive. They're incredibly expensive to produce and so on. But at the same time, they are justified on the basis of deterrence, mutually assured destruction, etc. If you want peace, prepare for war. And having the nuclear weapons was a kind of best prep, because then if you have parity or balance and you can strike the enemy, that'll deter them from striking you. However, that calculus only applies, as far as the great powers are concerned, to the great powers. They don't want anyone else having the ability to deter them. That's why they hate North Korea. Now, North Korea has many weaknesses, but one of its strengths is it has nuclear weapons, right? How has North Korea survived today without being invaded and so on and so forth? Because it has these weapons of mass destruction. Where's Libya? Where's Iraq? They don't exist anymore the way they did. So India, of course, secretly did it and so on and so forth, and then they made a deal. And India became on side and so on. Israel has its nuclear weapons. right? Undeclared and so on, but they have them. That's an ally. So there you support them. So there's been always what you could call, people call nuclear apartheid, the kind of separations and so on. So I'm not surprised then that you would want to do anything in your power once you're inside the club to make sure that nobody else gets into that club. And you do everything you can, because that just complexifies everything. It means you can't do as much to them as they could back to you. They raise the cost of war. So that's, I think, one key thing. And the other thing, of course, is a special relationship. I mean, it is special in the sense, if you like, I mean, since 1945 and then 1956 and Suez, Britain has hitched its wagon to the United States in every way which is significant. One was in the kind of construction of the liberal international order. Britain was right in on the ground floor of the United Nations and the Security Council. Then 1949, the formation of NATO, which Ernest Bevin, Foreign Secretary, saw as a great opportunity, accompanying with the Marshall Plan, etc. And then 1956, however, was a kind of big wake-up call when Britain, France, and Israel decided they were going to take over the Suez Canal. And President Eisenhower said, "You're not." And then they didn't. And France decided, well, that's not very good. You get de Gaulle. Britain decided, well, that's not very good. You stay close and whisper in the ear of the emperor from now on. Don't do anything openly and independently. So in that sense, then, the British foreign policy establishment, which itself is rooted in colonial power and is an elite in the sense of it's unaccountable, broadly unrepresentative, and its own ideas about what it is in the world. I don't know if any of you ever visited the Foreign Office building in Whitehall. You go up, there's a huge staircase. There's this kind of red carpet there, and at the top of that staircase is this huge mural. It's still there. It's the empire. It's the colonial empire, the kind of natives and hunters and people with these hats on and rifles and short trousers and khakis. And you kind of go up there, you think, what? This is 2026, and this thing is there. Anybody who comes to the Foreign Office, it has to go up those stairs. And all the people showing you in are embarrassed, but it's still there. And that mentality, but the ability to exercise global power, Britain no longer has it independently and hasn't had it for a very long time. So the special relationship is a fabulous relationship for a relatively small proportion of the British population. The militaries, the people who work in the military industries, BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce, a few 100,000 jobs. Yeah, okay. Then you got the City of London, which is still probably even bigger than New York now, compared with Wall Street. City of London is still a global hub. Trillions of dollars and pounds flow through the City of London. It's fully integrated into the American system and the Singaporean and the Hong Kong and the Japanese and so on. So then you look at the City of London is like a little world power by itself. It's not even governed fully by the British government. The City of London Corporation is some feudal relic which doesn't even have one vote, one person as a kind of fundamental principle. Companies have votes in the City of London. So, just to say, if you like, then the special relationship, having a relationship with the United States, militarily, financially, economically, institutionally, at the United Nations and elsewhere, is a fundamental part of the British elite's strategy for world politics. Then, therefore, you're going to get screwed from time to time because and this was all said in the 1940s. If you just open up the Foreign Office debates in 1943 to 44, 45, in the cabinet and elsewhere as well, all of this was prefigured right then. You do this, then the United States has got all the money, it's got the military, and we're going to have to go into places and people and we don't want to go, but we're going to have to go because that's the cost of an alliance with the biggest power in the world. And that's the cost. And the costs are borne by a very large number of other people. You mentioned the Strategic Defense Review and the National Security Strategy last summer and so on. Those are whole of society impacts. It's like Britain is preparing for whatever the new type of warfare is, Britain is in it, right? Some hybrid, some people say that World War III is already happening. It's just a different kind of war. It's a cyber war, it's information warfare, misinformation, disinformation, all kinds of warfare going, including military as well. Everything in between. So yes, there is a specialism. It is dragging Britain in various directions. But that's, if you like, in Starmer, the Labour Party, the Labour government is one of the architects of that special relationship, right? Clement Attlee, Ernest Bevin, and others, Tony Blair, much later, and now Keir Starmer is continuing that long tradition. The other thing was about we're trapped. I don't know if we're trapped. I think about my life. I wake up in the morning, I read about Donald Trump, get depressed. I get on the tube, I meditate. I get at the other side, I teach my class, Wilsonian roots of Trumpism. Students are really interested. Wow, they think blah, 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 and so on. I have my nice little lunch with my nice little colleagues, and I go home to my nice house, and I watch TV and so on. And I think life is not that bad. I've got a nice garden and so on. That is to say, yes, there's this, and then there's everyday life, which we live. And I think there is something real about everyday life too. It's not an illusion. So things aren't that bad. They are very bad for very many people, but they're actually not that bad for the vast majority of people. And so we're in this kind of this place. We recognize it now. You go on to this, I can read the collected thoughts of Donald Trump within 10 seconds. But I could also read people who sort of say, well, actually, what he says is not true. Why the media goes around chasing after his statements when we know he's a liar? He's the biggest liar ever recorded by the Washington Post. But anyway, I'd say, but I don't think we're trapped. I think we have agency too. So if you look in the world today, you've got all this sort of elite networks and so on. But you just, you look at the number of marches, you look at the number of protests and demonstrations, look at the number of people who are refusing to accept what they get paid, or how they have to live, or what the police have done, or what somebody else has said, or what war is going on, or why are we buying weapons or selling weapons, or why are we buying goods from this country or that country who are violating this norm or that law, and so on. At the local level, the national level, and at the international level, there are people who get on ships and go to Gaza and so on. There are countries, 30 countries have signed the Hague Accords, where they're setting up rival institutions to sort of pressure this whole idea about the border peace for Gaza and so on as well. There's all those things going on too. The United States had this, Harvard University has this thing called the Crowd Counting Consortium. Yep, they count the crowds in the country at every protest, every demonstration, everywhere in the country that they can find. And they said, this is the most intense period of mass discontent and protest in the history of the United States since the Civil War. That ended in 1865. So it's bigger than the 1930s. It's bigger than the 1890s, populism. It's bigger than the 1930s, with the Great Depression. It's bigger than the 1960s, with the civil rights, women's rights, everybody's rights kinds of movements and so on. And it's across all 50 states. These No Kings, 8 million on one day. That's the biggest single one-day protest in the history of the United States. So the media gives us elite politics. He said, she said, blah, blah, blah. But actually, if you dig deeper and deeper down, there's a huge amount of massive people taking charge, exercising power. And believe me, the elites know exactly how endangered they are. And that's why I would argue, when you just look at the media machine as a system of propaganda, information, education, advertising. It's a huge amount spent on that. That's not spent for no reason. It's spent in order to persuade and to set agendas and so on. That's what I was talking about. So I'd say we're not trapped. We have an opportunity.
You see a lot of meaning. Any more questions?
Well, you're here, right? Yeah.
Donald Trump's mind so well. I have my own ideas about why Donald Trump is not going to talk to Iran until they promise not to proliferate the weapons. So, what relationship do they have with Israel, who is actually, they're actually in conflict? What that I mean is that is Israel doing USA's work and turning a blind eye, or how is it going to work out? Get to a war, because they're both, doing this sort of jiggle dance.
Another question?
Just a quick question. I wondered how much you thought the English language has contributed to the hegemony of this integrated power system that you've described, because I think personally it would be quite important.
Yeah. Okay, so the first one was about really Israel and the United States, and I assume you're kind of asking about the sort of the power relationship between the two. And that's a very big controversial question. I write sometimes for a magazine. It's a university-owned, university people-only magazine called The Conversation. So only people in universities and researchers are allowed to write for it. It's called The Conversation. It's free. If you just Google it. A colleague and I just wrote recently an article about the very question about Israel dragging the United States around with it into conflicts and so on. And quite frankly, we turn that upside down. What we argue is that the United States is the power. Israel is the United States ally in that place. That's not to say small powers can't often exercise a degree of influence in tactical terms over great powers. They do. South Korea does it with the United States. Lots of different countries try to do it with a bigger power. But to say that they hold the power in the balance of the relationship is just generally historically and empirically incorrect. President Truman unilaterally recognized the state of Israel against the advice of the State Department when Israel was formed. The amount of support Israel got from the United States was relatively minimal until after 1967. And what happened in 1967 was Israel proved its ability militarily to defeat Arab attackers. And they did the same in 1973. So if you just follow the money and the rates of foreign aid from 1948 to 1967, it's very low. In fact, France is the biggest supplier of weaponry to Israel up until after 1967. Not the United States, France. After 1967, the foreign aid, military aid, it just is like a cliff. Up and upward, it just goes straight up. And 73, it goes up. So people say, oh, well, there's a Jewish lobby, the Israel lobby. Well, they followed the policy. They are enablers of the policy by organizing two things. One, support, public support, and two, besmirching their enemies. That is, smearing anybody who would oppose them in public. And they've got stronger and stronger. The stronger the US support for Israel became, which also was their support of the Israeli nuclear weapons system as well. So, okay, so we then get to Iran. Okay, so there's a really good article in the New York Times from a forthcoming book by Maggie Haberman and another one In February 2026, Netanyahu goes to the White House. He's in the Situation Room. Most foreign leaders are not allowed in the Situation Room. He gives a presentation. It's a very nice fairy tale. It says, Iran is led by a few people. Kill the people, kill those people. Iranians will love you. You can march in. There'll be flowers in the streets and so on. A bit like the kind of 2003 scenario for Iraq and so on. He gives this presentation. The majority of the people in the room, once Netanyahu leaves and J.D. Vance returns, Trump says, what do you think? He said, it's a fairy tale. They always say this. They always say, because they want us in. They need us in. Without us, they can't do it. They said, best not do it. The various ways. J.D. Vance, for all his faults, was the one who said, don't do it. This is, you're going to get hammered there. But this is not a strategy. The Iranian regime is not a few people. The Iranian regime is like a guerrilla regime. It's made up of cells. You can knock out one cell, but the rest of the cells keep going. And that's why they haven't had a leadership crisis, despite the fact that on the day that they were gathered, when Israel attacked, a large number of them were wiped out. But they don't work like a normal government, if you like, because they've never been allowed to be a normal government since 1979. They've been preparing for this for a very long time. And that's why now they have frightened America's Gulf allies to such a degree that they're saying, don't use your bases in our countries anymore because we're being endangered. You said you were our protectors. We've had you here because you guaranteed our security. What did the Americans do in Saudi? They don't even have hard bunkers to hide in, the American soldiers, in case anybody attacks. So what do? They ran off to the five-star hotels. They literally abandoned the bases. They ran to the five-star hotels. And when the five-star hotel people realized what was happening, and that the ordinary guests are now getting bombed because the five-star hotels are now getting bombed, they said, get out. What are you doing here? So I would say Israel is a staunch ally, but it is also the recipient of a huge amount of armed support, financial support, military support, and every diplomatic and every other kind of protection. If the United States and all the other people who complain about what Israel does in Lebanon and Gaza and so on were to stop the arms flows, Israel would not be able to sustain war for a very long time at all. Israel doesn't call the shot, it's actually a dependent power. But it suits certain elements to make that kind of case, but it just doesn't sort of accord with anything empirically real in the world, as opposed to the messaging which occurs. The other thing about the English language, yeah, I think for England, for Britain, it was kind of fortuitous that the next superpower that came along was an English-speaking superpower. And therefore, its kind of language remained a global language, and it spread even further. Yeah, so yes, the English language has played a big role. So it has also played a big role in people here not learning to speak other languages as well. Yeah.
We'll have to stop here, and please go and coffee next door, but otherwise, thank you very much. Thank you. So, yeah, you stop it. I like the way you led the argument. It doesn't argue against. That's why I said, we're trapped. No, but no.
Yeah, I think it's truly, there's no chance. It's very complicated. It's very, there's the complexity.
Yeah, but I like the fact that because we're so integrated, there's unlikely, because if you start a war, you kill yourself.
Yeah.
Right. So it reduces the system.
And that's why it's partly.
Yeah.
Cost of living crisis.
So it's really sorry for the millions of global suffering or something.
Yes.
Sorry, I was going to ask the question of the guy on the ground. And it's, I found it a difficult question to frame. It's just that I didn't really grasp the populism as a concept.